Welcome to Trinity Radio. You found the channel that loves atheists. And today I have a special guest. This is YouTube phenomenon in terms of internet Christian apologetics, Cameron Bertuzzi. And he said this about me before, but it is true. I can say it about him. He's been a close friend, and we've talked at times when we've both been going through really difficult situations. And even though from your perspective, we could be on the other side of the planet from each other right now, we're actually in the same room.
We are.
Look over there and see Cameron.
We are. We could touch fingers if we need. We can't.
There it is. Yeah. And so I'm really excited to have you here, Cameron, because you're speaking at our church and talking about apologetics. But man, thanks for being here.
Yeah. This is really cool. It's fun to see your actual studio. Mm-hmm. We'll call it a studio.
Go ahead, get it all out. Get it all out right now.
It is fun to be here. So I appreciate your pastor for bringing me out and everything to talk about the problem of evil. It's really cool.
And people were there last night. We did a thing last night where it was all for Christians and stuff, but it was really fun. And if it would make you feel more at home as we talk about Catholic stuff, I could just say, well, I met Fred. Welcome to Points with Aquinas. And so we could just make
that is good.
Does that make you feel more at home?
It does.
Okay.
I'm now just completely just at home now.
Yeah. All right. So we knew we'd be together, and we knew that we had to record something, but it was kind of like, well, what are we gonna talk about? Well, I thought it had to be Catholicism. And for those that don't know, Cameron is not Catholic currently, but he has been investigating this for a while now and has seen some good reason from his perspective to think that Catholicism is true, even though he was raised as a quote unquote Protestant, right? And so everybody's been talking to you about that lately. Do you want to say anything about that whole ball of wax before I tell what we're going to specifically talk about today?
No, only that I haven't done a whole lot of research as of late on Catholicism, but I plan on doing a whole lot more in the coming months. So that's the only caveat I want to give to this interview, is that it's just not something that's been directly on my mind, but I'm really excited actually to talk about what you and I are going to talk about today, because I haven't really explored it yet. So cool. I'm really excited about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So as we've been talking on the phone and stuff, and we've talked about this, and Cameron knows that I'm not seeing what he's seeing exactly. And I think that resonates with a lot of you out there who think, I don't get it. I hear what is being said in terms of reasons to believe that it's true. And I immediately think of a number of things. And then there are Catholics over there that are like, man, maybe the only reason that he's not already Catholic is because of what it would cost him. And so I've thought about this, and I brought up to Cameron, I said, I don't, and I'll say this publicly now. I said, I don't know if God laid this on my heart to tell you this, or if it's Braxton. But I'm going to tell you.
Or maybe a little both.
It could be, but you decide, okay?
Okay.
I'm just not putting this on God's lips in case it's not, right? But I felt led to tell you that I believe that if you become Catholic, there are going to be a number of things that are going to happen. I believe there's going to be a lot of fanfare, and understandably, people are excited, And I think that you're going to talk about that experience, and I think that it's not inconceivable to think that that some Catholic organization may ask you to write a book about your experience of assessing the evidence, have you on shows. It could be a big thing. And so in a certain respect, for people who are trying to develop a platform for the good of the kingdom, that could be a strong influence itself. And then, of course, on the other side, there are cons. And so I thought what we could do here is, instead of talking about whether or not Catholicism is true, what I've run into with Cameron is, when we've been talking and I'm talking to him about whether or not it's true, I'll ask him a question about the consequences, and often he'll say, to his credit, I haven't even spent that much time thinking about the consequences of affirming this. I've only really been thinking about, is it true or not? Because of course we want to affirm things that are true, right? But I thought here we could talk about the consequences of remaining Protestant or of becoming Catholic. Why did you agree to talk about this with me?
Like I mentioned briefly, this is not something that I've really done a whole lot of thinking about, and you just mentioned that too. So it's something that I would like to explore, and you seem like the perfect person to actually explore some of these consequences with. So that's why I'm kind of willing to talk about it now, is that I think you're the right person to do it with.
Well, you've come to the right place, Cameron. I agree. I got to mix in a little Pritchett when Jonathan Pritchett, my co-host, isn't here. But all right, so obviously, one of the most obvious implications is related to whether or not it's true.
Yeah.
But I think it's still worth talking about, which is the salvific side of this.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Protestants, and I think a benefit is, if it's true, forget which side you should, in a Pascalian sense, sort of come down on if it were just on this one thing. The fact about it is there are goods like coming into the right understanding of God's kingdom and all those kind of things, and we want that too as Protestants. But in terms of the salvific side of this, that seems like the stakes are really, really high. Are they that high? And so my understanding of the playing field is, if you became Catholic,
mm-hmm.
you wouldn't necessarily be required to think that I'm suddenly not a Christian anymore.
Right.
So do you have any thoughts about that?
That I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on. All I know is that from what I've heard, Vatican II has made it clear that Protestants can be saved and that they're like brothers and sisters in the kingdom. Mm-hmm. So that's the only the extent of my knowledge on the salvific side of things. So it's that's really all that I know.
Do you get the sense that's something that some Catholics would have their own, like, maybe, can you have a difference of opinion about that to your understanding?
There is the possibility. So there are some, I think they call them rad trad Catholics, where they deny Vatican I and Vatican II. I could be wrong about that, but I know that for sure that they deny Vatican II. So there are some Catholics who deny that those ecumenical councils or the, I forget what you actually refer to them as, but there are people who reject those documents as like valid.
Gotcha.
So there are some people who still they're traditional, rad trads, radical traditionalists. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what that stands for.
So you've got that on one side, right?
Yeah.
So on the Catholic side, at least the answer we're going with for the time being is, I think at the very least, it's not necessarily true that non-Catholics are not saved as long as they are professing Christ and all that. On the Protestant side, as Catholics will often remind us of, you have more of a mixed bag, right? That's the whole point. That's one of the whole points, right?
Yeah.
Is that problem. But within that mixed bag, there are people who would say, I don't know, man, this does seem like a salvific thing. It seems a little bit like, so if you just took, so is there more danger in that respect? Possibly, if you are thinking of it in a Pascalian sort of way, Pascal's wager sort of way, in saying, okay, it looks like on the Protestant side, there is the potential of eternal danger. On the Catholic side, it doesn't look like there is.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I'm actually going to do a conversation with a guy that I've had on the channel. You know what I just noticed?
What?
That when you're looking to the left of the screen and I'm looking like to the right of the screen when you and I are talking.
Hold on.
You should have flipped it.
I'm going to flip it. Okay, hold on. You're going to be full screen for just a second.
Okay.
Boom.
There we go. Now now it looks like we're talking to each other.
What you people don't know out there in internet land is that when Cameron came in here, he did the best he could with my equipment. And right now he's using the secondary equipment of my already third-hand equipment. And he did the best he could, but I said, you'd cry if you had to use this equipment. He said, of course I would. So anyway, don't hold it. He looks better on that bag camera than most of us do on a good camera. But anyway, go ahead, Cameron.
Yeah, no. So I'm having a guy, his name is Alex Plato, and he and I are going to discuss Pascal's wager as it relates to Catholicism. So I don't think it's a salvific issue, but I do think that if Catholicism is true and you're Protestant, then you're missing out on a whole lot. You're missing out on all the sacraments, the Eucharist, and there's a lot of things that you're actually missing out on. Confession. Whereas if Catholicism is not true and you're a Protestant, what are you missing out on? Mm-hmm. You're not really missing out on a lot, or you're not missing out on anything, I suppose. But so I think that there are some Pascalian type reasons for becoming Catholic.
So when I think about this, the reason I raise it this way is because obviously salvation is going to be an important feature of this whole thing. But I understand that I don't want to give the impression that, like some Protestants, many Protestants, it's only about salvation, or salvation is only about not going to hell and going to heaven. Because I would say the gospel is the kingdom is coming.
Mm-hmm.
The gospel is, of course, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15, but there is as a gospel mentioned in the beginning of Mark. So we have this gospel, the gospel of the kingdom. And if you're a Protestant, one reason to become a Christian is to be in God's kingdom, in the right kingdom.
Yeah.
And if the Catholic expression of that is the correct one, then okay, that's a benefit. There is, however, that issue that we've been discussing, which is okay, but I am a little interested in whether I'm going to hell or not too.
Yeah.
So I think that's good. Another thing I would want to ask about is, okay, when you were with Fred on Pints with Aquinas,
so bad.
Yeah, it is really bad. It's not even that great. I always do. Who is the Ray Comfort? When Ray Comfort debated Matt Dillahunty on Modern Day Debates. I think of this sometimes and laugh, even though I'm completely alone. Is Matt would said something about being an atheist, and Ray Comfort said, "There's no such thing as an atheist, Matt. You know that." And I think about that all the time. Just makes me crack up. But no, seriously, when you were on with Matt, he asked you about doctrinal positions that you enjoy holding. I think we can say
enjoy,
not that you don't think they're true. You've come to them because you do think they're true.
Yeah.
But I think you're happy to find that you think they're true.
Yeah.
Things like conditional immortality, or the possibility of an evangelical form of universalism. Not an Oprah Winfrey necessarily style universalism, where it doesn't matter what you think or believe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, where my understanding of where you're thinking is right now is, okay, if the papacy is valid and is what it claims to be, game over.
Sort of, yeah. I think it actually just raises the probability really high. So it's not necessarily game over, because there are some argument. And this is what I was talking with Blake Junta actually about recently. So this, I think, would give a very, very strong bump to Catholicism being true, but you could still have arguments against Catholicism that aren't related to the papacy. So there are some, you could look at any kind of any specific doctrine that Catholicism sort of necessitates, like perpetual virginity of Mary. Okay, so that is a doctrine that you've got to hold as a Catholic. But if you have arguments against perpetual virginity, then this is an argument against Catholicism that doesn't really necessarily relate to the papacy, like explicitly. It might have some kind of like implicit relation.
Is it as simple as this? I guess this is what I want to know. Is it as simple as this? If Mary ever wasn't a virgin, Catholicism is false.
If she ever wasn't a virgin, then Catholicism is false. Something like that.
Because it would break the beliefs about the papacy.
Yeah. Well, no, it wouldn't break the beliefs about the papacy explicitly, although I think that there have been papal claims that basically make it dogma, that you've got to believe this.
And I realize, and everyone should know, Cameron is walking through this right now, but that doesn't mean he has all the answers. If he had all the answers, he'd probably already know where he's going to land, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I'm doing what I can to really the thing that I've been focusing most on is the papacy. So like these other issues, like the one that I just mentioned about perpetual virginity, I haven't really looked into that. Like I just got off the phone with Trent Horn yesterday talking about some of the reasons why Catholics affirm that doctrine. But the point that I was making is that there are some. So the papacy, if it were true, it would raise the probability of Catholicism significantly, but there are nevertheless other considerations that could weigh against Catholicism, just like if you had arguments against perpetual virginity or arguments against these other Marian doctrines or any other doctrine that is you've got to hold as a Catholic.
So is it did I understand you correctly with Matt that basically what you said is, in spite of that being true, if you became convinced that the papacy was valid and that Catholicism was true,
or if I was able to work through these other possible objections,
would annihilationism be an objection? Like, I really think the Bible teaches annihilationism.
Yeah, if I really believe that, and I think that where I currently sit on that is I lean toward it being true, but it wouldn't surprise me if it were false. It wouldn't. It would be a little bit surprising, but that's not one of the issues where I'm like, I've always been sort of just tentatively drawn to annihilationism. But
we could take that, even if it's got a low weight, we could throw that in the box. If we're just talking about not what's true, but about what is a pro and con, What's
That
going-
might be, so the way to put it in like Bayesian terms would be like, that is like a small piece of evidence against Catholicism. That could be like one small piece of evidence. So in the total,
but forget arguments for a minute. In terms of just a pro or con for your life, if you affirm Protestantism, the pro would be, I get to keep holding some of these doctrines, like that one, right? Would that be?
Or I get to lean toward.
I get to continue whatever I'm currently thinking about it. I get to continue that.
Yeah.
But if I decide that Catholicism is true, then just based on the fact that there are doctrinal positions built into it on some of these issues, I'm just going to submit to the authority of the church on that.
Yeah, kind of.
Well, open that up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it relates back to the idea that there are, and I'm trying to like figure out exactly how I'm supposed to sit on this, because to be a Catholic, I don't think you have to believe that it's 100%, like it's true with 100% certainty.
Right.
So you could like, the papacy could give you a bump to think that, okay, now Catholicism is 95% true. But then you have these other objections to Catholicism, like say annihilationism, that maybe takes it down from 95% true to like 93% true. And so you'd still believe that Catholicism is true, but just not as to as high of a degree. And I think that's true of Christianity as well. It's like, I'm not 100% certain that Christianity is true. I'm not 100% certain of a lot of things. Like there's in philosophy, a lot of people know this, but if your listeners are just sort of hearing this for the first time, it's very rare to find some proposition or some belief that you hold with 100% certainty.
Right, yeah.
So, and I think that's the way that it would sort of play out, is you'd get a really strong bump from the papacy that Catholicism is true, but then nevertheless, you could have these other considerations that sort of weigh against, but then ultimately you'd have to weigh like, okay, well, how likely is Catholicism given all of this evidence and all of the different arguments? That's why I think Bayes is so relevant here, is because you can model all of these different pieces of data and plug it into one big calculation and then come up with a number that more or less models like where your credence should be in whatever belief we're talking about. In this case, we're talking about Catholicism.
Yeah.
So,
and the interesting thing about this, and I know you've thought about all these things to a greater extent than I have, especially recently, but when you think about Catholicism, it's not as though I'm trying to decide whether a particular end times position is true, or I'm trying to decide about a particular view of hell or first things or whatever. It's a little bit more than that, because if you affirm young Earth creationism or whatever, then okay, you've affirmed young Earth creationism. Nothing else necessarily has to change, although there may be implications. Catholicism is like a whole big framework that comes and sits on top of the scripture and your experience and all those kind of other things. And so that is a bigger sort of, a heavier, weightier sort of thing to accept. And I think that's why for you, it means coming at it from a number of different ways to figure out does the whole thing seem probable based on the question, do these supporting things seem probable? Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think the papacy to me is something that would give the truth of Catholicism just a really, really strong bump in probability wise.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think it's so important. That's why I focus so much of my attention on it, because if it is true, then it would give such a significant probabilistic bump to Catholicism being true that it's really important to like focus all of my attention on that. So that's part of the reason why I've been focusing so much of my attention there.
So what doctrinal position, do you know of any doctrinal positions other than the obvious quintessentially classic Catholic ones that have to do with Mary and perhaps the sacraments? Are you aware of other doctrinal positions that you would have to let go of, or things you're leaning toward that you'd have to back off?
Yeah, so there was a couple that I actually worked through recently, and one of them was divine simplicity. And so I had like a real big issue with the view that divine simplicity is true. Divine simplicity, how do I even explain this view for listeners who are just like coming at this at the first time? Divine simplicity is the view that God has no parts. So there's no parts in God. You may be actually able
Well,
to
what I was
explain
actually
this
going to
view
say
better
is I
than
think
can.
there's a great video you just did not too long ago, didn't you? With someone or had someone. Maybe I just saw it not too long ago, but you had someone talk about divine simplicity.
I've had people talk about it on my channel, but I
Yeah.
haven't done a show with the guy who has sort of changed my view on this.
Mm.
But I've had these objections, these various objections to Catholicism. Let me do instead of divine simplicity, let me do a different one.
But that is
Which
one
is-
to put in the bucket.
That is one, but I've worked
Okay.
through that recently.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
I was opened up to the rational possibility of divine simplicity being true,
Okay.
basically, and that was working through hearing a way that it's been spelled out by a guy named Joshua Sijuwati. He's a British philosopher. He's like the Black Swinburne is what I call him. He's
He was
amazing.
on your channel not too long
He was on my
ago.
channel a couple times, and he's really, really cool. He's been on, I guess, 3 times actually. But his model of divine simplicity really opened me up to the possibility of it being true. But there was another, so the Eucharist is something like that I have had a sort of metaphorical view of the Eucharist. But what I realized recently is that even if it's you take a metaphorical reading of John 6, and John 6 is the verse where Jesus says, "You have got to eat my flesh, you've got to eat my or drink my blood." Yeah, and so but I still to this day I have a metaphorical view of that reading of that text.
Mm-hmm.
But what I realized is that that's actually compatible with like the real presence view or like the Catholic view, because that's not even about the Last Supper in John 6. It's not a Last Supper narrative. So you could take a metaphorical reading of that, but then still hold that when it actually comes to the Last Supper, Jesus was talking about his body and his blood.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that I've sort of changed my mind on recently, where I lean toward that view still, this metaphorical reading of John 6, but nevertheless, like I could still have that view. And then if I were to accept the papacy, then I would not, like, it's not really an objection to Catholicism per se.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it was. Like for the longest time, I thought that, no, a metaphorical reading of John 6 meant that Catholicism is probably not true. But then I came to realize, no, that's not the case. And I came to that actually on my own. Like I just thought about it one day and I was like, wait a second, that doesn't actually follow. Like there is a possible out here for Catholicism, in that you could take a metaphorical reading of John 6 and then take a sort of literal reading of the Last Supper narratives I think it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
So those actually are a couple of examples of doctrinal positions where you actually have already, if not become convinced, at least can see, okay, that's not as big of a problem as I thought it was.
Mm-hmm. Those were my big issues. That divine simplicity, the Eucharist, and there was one other one that I can't think of off the top of my head. But there were a couple different doctrines where this is sort of what was holding me back. And then after I worked through those, then I went and talked to Mike Winger and I talked to Gavin Ortland, and I was like, hey, look, I worked through these objections that I had to Catholicism. Like, what should I do at this point? Like, should I become Catholic? Should I look at some other objections that you've got to Catholicism?
I'm going to presume that Mike did not say, yes, you should become Catholic.
Correct. Yeah, he did not say that. So he told me to focus in on the papacy. And so he was like, if the papacy is true, like he would become Catholic. I think I'm quoting him correctly on that. So but he has these objections based on, like, in Vatican I, you've got these really strong claims of what the papacy was like. It was known in every age. But then when you actually look into the Bible and you look into early history, you don't really see that there. And so that really intrigued me. And I was like, well, let me go talk to some Catholic apologists and see what's going on with this. At this point, I'm just kind of telling the whole story.
That's fine, man.
Of where it's been.
That's
okay.
fine. I do have some more questions I want to get to, but you're good.
Okay. Yeah. So I talked to Trent Horn. I've talked to Jimmy Akin. Based on like what I've learned from these different people, from Mike Winger and from Jimmy Akin, like the people that are on both sides of the issue, I was like, there is so much here when it comes to the papacy. Like, I need to really see everything like laid out in front of me so that I can weigh each individual piece instead of just coming to like some general conclusion based on, how things sort of feel or how things sort of seem to me. Like, there's maybe one really strong consideration in favor of the papacy. There's a few other sort of weaker considerations against the papacy. How do you actually weigh those? And so I was thinking about that, and I was like, what would be the best way to actually do this would be to do like a Bayesian analysis of this, of the papacy itself. So like take each data point that is relevant to the papacy, like these different verses in the Bible, like Matthew 16, like Luke 22, like John 21, and then actually ask the question, like, how likely is this data given the papacy? How likely is this data given the falsity of the papacy? Plug that into an actual Bayesian calculation and just sort of see where the numbers go from there. And then also plug in all of the different arguments from Gavin Ortland and Mike Winger against the papacy and just kind of see like where do the numbers actually fit in here and where should my credence in this doctrine actually be, as opposed to just being swayed by, some good sounding rhetoric or like, yeah, that sounds like a really good objection to Catholicism. Like I'm just going to stay Protestant, but then actually do the hard work of weighing these different pieces of data and actually getting a probability that is based on good reason. And so I just felt like doing a sort of Bayesian analysis of the papacy was like the best way to go for me. And I realized a lot of people are going to object.
Where are you at in that percentage wise if we're looking at a loading bar?
So the percentage as of late, I think is it's either in the 80s or the 90s. So
we're getting close.
The papacy.
Oh, okay. I was saying like in a loading bar, like in terms of
how much data,
how close you are to being done with that process.
Although
I think you may have just given me something even more interesting.
No,
so you're 90. You think that Bayesian calculation gives you the papacy as valid? Currently, you have it up to
80 to 90%.
And when we say
if I had my computer, I could just pull it up and show you.
But when you say currently, that you say that way because you still have other things you're planning to include in that calculation that could change it.
Yes. So most of the things that I have to include are actually things that are going to favor the papacy. So it's at 80 or 90% now, and the stuff that I have to include is only going to make it higher. Now, however, there's one piece of data that is weighing heavily on the side of the papacy that I'm very tentative on at this point. And it's the typological connection between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. Basically, in Matthew 16, that's the passage about Peter being the rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Whatever you, and then he gives Peter the keys to the kingdom, and then says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And there's this connection that some people have been making between that and another office that is located in Isaiah 22 by a guy named Eliakim. And Eliakim, there's very similar language. They say Swan Sona is like the main proponent of this type of argument. He says that there's a typological connection, like a sort of fulfillment of the Old Testament to the New Testament in Peter. And this office was successive. It was like second in command, which would make sense with Peter being second in command to Jesus. And so there's basically what I found is that data, if there is this connection, this typological connection between Peter and Eliakim, if that is real, then that is pretty likely, if the papacy is true, to get some type of connection like this. But if if the papacy is not true, how likely is it that we would have this connection? And that seems pretty low. Like it seems pretty low that we would have.
There's two great debates recently on this issue that I think we should point people to. I was thinking of this when you last night, speaking at a local church, mentioned someone was asking, well, how do I learn, what other people believe in a clear way? And I was thinking debates is a good way because you're not just getting that opponent through the lens of your guy, right? But you're getting both on their own terms.
Yeah.
And there are two great debates on this that I can think of, and I think one of them might have been on your channel. One was Gavin Ortland and
Swan Sona.
That one is fantastic.
It's so good.
And there, since you kind of enunciated the Catholic position on that, Gavin Ortland's primary concern is, and it's a way of saying.
I love the way he says it too. His
terminology, or what is it? Typology run amok.
Yeah.
But the thing about it with that is it put legs on what I said to you on the phone that was my concern, which is this is where I feel like the squirrely stuff gets in. That's my Protestant take, and that was a way of saying what he's saying there. And what I needed was, or what I would want to see is some didactic teaching about this, and a typology, or just the teaching, but the typology without the didactic teaching is what is difficult. But I see what you mean. If that is an intended typological connection,
Yeah.
then that I can see why someone might see, okay, that looks
That would be
very much, shouldn't Peter
Yeah.
then function according to that typology? Is that kind of how it goes?
How likely? So yeah, when
And it looks like he did, and it looks like the Pope.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then the question is, how likely is this data given the papacy? And that's fairly expected. Like I put it at like 0.5. Like as likely as not that we would have this data. But then how likely is this data if the papacy is not true? I put that as pretty low. So like 0.01, like 1% chance that we'd have this typological connection, and the papacy is not true. So what that's doing a lot of work in the overall case that I'm looking at in the Bayesian analysis.
That is or is not already in your numbers?
It's in the numbers right now, and that's how I have it set up. So I'm giving a lot of weight to this typological issue. Now, the reason why I'm still tentative and why I'm not Catholic at this point, given the numbers, is because I'm not sold on the typological argument yet.
So now this reminds me, a moment ago I wanted to say something to anyone listening, is that you say that according to your Bayesian thing right now, 80 to 90%.
Yeah.
That's not to say that your credence in Catholicism is 80 to 90%.
No.
It's to say that I'm building an argument, and right now this is where it sits. But for example, with the typological thing, if Gavin convinces you or someone else that this just doesn't work,
it's not data that's relevant. Yeah. If this isn't any data, then that takes away a real strong piece of the evidence in favor of the papacy.
Yeah.
So if I get rid of that, then the probability is going to be, it may even drop lower. I don't know.
Okay.
I'd have to look, but
That'd
it
be
may drop.
interesting.
Yeah. It may drop below 50%.
Okay.
Something like that.
That's important.
So,
I think we've really isolated some. I mean, you already had, but I think we've really isolated something for
it's
listeners.
It's a really important, like that's why I've been so interested in seeing the back and forth and the debate that you had, or that you mentioned, between Gavin and Swan. And Swan and Gavin are actually doing like more work on this. Swan just recently published on his channel, responding to every single objection that Gavin raised in their debate. And so he just like did a systematic run through and responded to every single different objection that he raised. And
wow.
I listened to that the other day, and it was pretty good. But I'm still on the fence about that argument. And so that's probably why I'm still on the fence about Catholicism, generally, is because I'm just on the fence about that one issue that's so important and could be the deciding factor, like either way.
Okay. I think people should be happy to know that while philosophy is a part of this, the Bible is too, because that typological construct is a biblical argument. Yeah. So, okay. So we've got all that, and that was good that you kind of just walked us through it. One thing I want to know is okay, so there have been times in my life where I've moved on a doctrinal issue, not something as grandiose in the way we described a moment ago as embracing Catholicism. And I think the fact that it is so grandiose is why some people speak of it as a conversion, even for a Christian. Yeah. Right. But when I've moved on doctrinal positions, I've never had, if I'm convinced something is true, I've never had any trouble saying I'm convinced this is true because I can defend it. But where I've worried is in terms of how my family might react to that. And I could see, while we've talked about some of the pros of becoming Catholic, and I do want to come back to that because I had asked you earlier today, and I'd like to ask you again why you would like to become Catholic. But what about the pressure from those closest to you? Or not necessarily the pressure, but the worry about what they would think about this? Yeah, that is something that is weighing heavily on me as of late, is like what this would actually look like. Because as I've done this study on the papacy, and I'm getting more confident about the numbers and everything that are in this document that I've created, it's looking like it is a real possibility that I should be Catholic, and really everybody should be Catholic if this is true. But what does that actually mean for me personally and for my family? And it's been weighing heavily on me lately.
There are reasons why I want to be Catholic, and I've said that before. One of the biggest reasons is beauty. Catholicism, I find a lot of beauty in the liturgy and in just the churches, like in general. And in the way of beauty is like a way into Catholicism. Like that's a traditionally known way of becoming Catholic, actually, is through beauty. And Bishop Robert Barron is actually one of the big guys on that. Anyways, those are some of the reasons why I've been drawn to it. But now I'm like, how is this actually going to look family wise? And I've said this before and I'll say it again. My wife is like not on board with me becoming Catholic. And so like we haven't really discussed it because I'm still working through this analysis. And so I haven't really actually come down on either side. So I'm kind of like just pushing it off to the side and just like, I don't know what I'm going to do if it actually gets to that point, but I've just kind of been like not thinking about it.
I wonder what Catholics think. Like, so I wonder what Catholics would say. And I'm sure there's a variety of opinions, but Catholic thinkers like we would talk to.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what they would say about a person who comes to believe that Catholicism is true, but believes that people who are not Catholics are not necessarily unregenerate, and his wife or her husband, let's say, in either case, is like, no, I'm Protestant, and that's just, you're just gonna have to, I mean, that's what's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Okay. I wonder if there are any Catholics who would say, given that that's the case, it's more important that they be one flesh in worship than go to different churches, and God would be fine with that. I'd like to know how Catholics would react.
Yeah, I'd like to know that too. Yeah. I wonder if there are any Catholics who are like, no, stay Protestant, or like,
yeah, I want to know. I'm serious. I want to know.
Yeah.
And you know who you are. If you're out there and you're a Catholic and you are, I'm not going to say anything, but yeah, I do think that. Fess up. I want to hear it. I want Cameron to hear it.
Write it in the comments right now.
That's right.
Yeah. No, I want to know that too.
Mm-hmm. That's a pretty good question. Okay, so we've talked about that. We've talked about the doctrinal stuff on either side.
Where do you sit on Catholicism?
Okay, so for me, that's a really good question. So I'll tell you what, I have a story with this.
Okay.
A few years ago, I had a friend who, and I can tell you who it was Donald J. Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
Donald J. Johnson wrote a book, How to Talk to a Skeptic. I endorsed the book in the front of the book. He endorsed my book, Core Facts. He's on my website as an endorsement. So we had a little bit of a friendship, might be too strong, but we interacted a lot, you know, and or at least enough. And he came and taught for us here at Trinity, and taught as a visiting lecturer, and taught about worldview stuff, worldview analysis, because he's great on that. But he became Catholic. And so I thought, okay, well, you know, this is interesting, because here's a guy that I think is a very, very clear thinker. He's very, and a lot of Catholics are, that's not what I mean, but someone who comes from my tradition, sees things kind of the way I do, and then became Catholic. And so I thought, he's going to give me. And so he was working on a film at the time that came to be released as Convinced. And many Catholics will know about this film. And Convinced was initially supposed to be about atheists becoming Christians. And he interviewed like Holly Ordway and a whole bunch of people who had become Catholic, who were atheists. Well, because he came Catholic during this time, he just changed Convinced to atheism to Catholicism, and not atheism to Christianity, which made sense. The guy had become Catholic, okay? But he said, you know, watch that film and see what you think. Well, when I watched that film, I did get some good answers. And they're the answers that I think Catholics interacting online are used to giving. Like, it seems so weird to Protestants that you would pray to saints or pray to Mary or something like that. You pray to God. What the heck? You know, what's going on here? And in the film, you know, he talked about, well, I mean, you ask friends to pray for you who are Christians, right? Well, we don't believe that Christians ever die. Not really. I mean, they're living forever. So what's wrong with asking them now to pray for you? And I thought, okay, well, I still think it's a little loopy, but at least I see how you get there. Right?
Yeah,
It's not that crazy. It's not anything so much to be scared of. And then really with the saints and Mary, just the difference between veneration and worship. And I have heard the criticisms that, like, okay, well, if it did turn into worship, how would you know the difference? Veneration looks a lot like worship and all that. But it was answered to my satisfaction to a certain degree. But the big issues, like a lot of it was, and in our conversations I felt this a little bit, is it's a tearing away what looks wacky to a Protestant about something as foreign as that. I'm not saying it is wacky. I'm just saying how it looks to outsiders.
Yeah.
Pulling that away, but I'm looking for the positive case. Why should I believe this is true? Like, in your construct about, and I wasn't even going to get into this, but here we are, the papacy as an explanation. I will admit that I'm not the Bayes guy to the degree that you are. But what I want to know is, okay, here's the papacy as an explanation for Matthew 16.
Mm-hmm.
And here is a Protestant explanation of Matthew 16.
Yeah.
Why does the papacy get to be, I guess is what I think a lot of times, because I've heard you say a lot of the arguments against that I've heard boil down to arguments from silence.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that. And I think I've now heard other proponents of my position say something similar to what I'm saying now, which seemed intuitive to me, which is to say that when we're talking about the existence of an entity that's supposed to have a mouthpiece for God as an aspect of it some of the time, and all these other things about Mary and these doctrinal positions that are somewhat unique and all of that, when you look at all that stuff, why, that seems like a proposition that you need to give me a case for, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm now sounding a little bit like the atheist, right? I'm sitting here going, why should I believe that? So really, when you ask me where I am right now, a lot of the stuff that I think are the rookie type criticisms, I get it. I'm fine with that.
Mm-hmm.
Those are peeled away. Great. And I am still learning, but from what I'm seeing, I don't think there's enough of a biblical defense for this as I'd like. I don't see how I would ever get my credence up high enough to accept this.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if I do, then I do.
Yeah. So I think that the typological thing is probably going to that's where all the action is. And that's what's kind of like exciting about the whole question is like, it's exciting in one sense, because if you're into this stuff, you're into it. And if you're not into it, then it's not going to be that exciting to you. But that's where I think where all the action is this typological issue. And if that is like, if there is this typological connection, then I do think we have some pretty decent evidence for the papacy. And so that would be like, I think that's something for you to look into as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, I haven't even done like the requisite research for my, that's
all
why
I've done is listen to your debates.
Yeah. And that's why like, I don't have a hard position like Gavin. I don't have a hard position like Swan. I'm kind of just like agnostic at this point, just listening to both sides go back and forth. But I think there is nevertheless like the potential for a good argument if Swan is right, or if like, I think there are other pretty popular Catholics who defend a typological connection here. But if he's right, then we do have some pretty strong evidence for a papal office. And there was one other thing that I was going to say, which is there was a guy I had on my channel. His name is Joe Heschmeyer. He made a really good point that's kind of stuck with me about like how much really would we expect the New Testament documents to create to like actually spell out what a papal office would look like. How much evidence would we expect the Bible to actually have in favor of the papacy? And the analogy that he gave is that in the Constitution, like the Constitution was creating the presidency. And so that's why there's so much about the presidency in the Constitution, is because that's that was the purpose of that document. But if in the case of the New Testament, like was the purpose of the New Testament to create this office? And I don't think the purpose of it was to create that office in the same way that it wasn't really created to like create any office. Like those offices already existed. The church was in existence before the New Testament was written. And so that's, I think, one consideration just to like keep in mind and maybe just work through as well, is just like, what are we expecting too much out of the New Testament? Are we expecting it to create this office?
My natural reaction is to like push back, but I don't want to. I'll say this much.
Okay.
Like, I think you're right. Like, obviously, I was just telling someone the other day in a stream that like they said, well, the way to know stuff about Jesus, the only real way to know stuff about God and about Jesus is in the Bible. And I'm like, well, hold on. Before the New Testament existed anyway, there were people worshiping and serving the Lord and understood doctrine and all these kind of things. Now, in the New Testament, we do have, like in Ephesians 4:11, where it lays out some things like pastor, evangelist, teacher, apostle, and we can talk about that. And I think for me, and I will continue to study, in fact, it's become an interesting thing. I just told you on the phone the other night, I'm thinking about going more. I'd like to start a new study on my own privately so that later that can be videos. And it's either right now it's probably going to be Islam, go more that way, just because I think practically that's more important to the kingdom. The way I see things is to focus on that. But it was either between that or Catholicism, and so I've started with yours and Pints with Aquinas, you know, and looking at those videos because I haven't bought any books or anything like that lately. I have stuff like this from seminary days, but you know, and so I'm looking at that, but those are just my initial thoughts. But yeah, well, I think we should continue to look into it. You're right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
you should look into the typology thing though too.
Yeah.
And like, because I mean,
and in favor of that,
that's what, everybody should look into it really.
In favor of that, to our listeners, if you don't really know exactly what he's talking about, you're at least probably familiar with someone pointing to an Old Testament figure, and the biblical authors do this, you know, pointing to an Old Testament figure and then pointing out in some way, some story or some person, something that is being fulfilled. And that thing may have had some sort of fulfillment in it, even in its own day. You know, Moses is like Jesus. Joseph certainly seems to be very much like Jesus, Old Testament Joseph, in many, many ways. David is like Jesus. Jesus is like David. You know, there's all these kind of things. So I think Christians are used to the notion of a typology or something.
Yeah.
It's and so that shouldn't be strange. And so when you go to look at that, don't shut it down just based on it being a typology. My only concern with it is I would like some clearer statement saying this is what I'm trying to establish here or something like that. But you do make a good point that if this was already something going on in the life of the church, maybe there was no need to state that. Food for thought.
Yeah.
So you have these, I've noticed with free will, let's say, libertarian freedom versus a deterministic understanding.
Something I haven't done much research on.
And that's exactly why I bring it up. What I want to say is you don't even care that much.
Yeah.
You care insofar as you want to have true beliefs, but like we're all drawn to certain particular things.
Yeah.
And that's just not something that you just care that much about. Leave that to somebody else, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why is this not like that? There's something more about this.
Catholicism?
Yeah.
Oh, good question.
Because you could have easily just said, yeah, I mean, that's a whole can of worms I'm not dealing with. Why did you say, no, I'm going to, is it just because it was interesting?
It was actually because I got invited to come onto Matt Fradd's show. And I went to his house like when he was still living in Atlanta. And we sat down and I talked about contingency and reformed epistemology and some other like fun things that I like to think about. And that, like, while I was there, I did like, he was just like, what, do you want to talk about Catholicism? Like, maybe we could do one of those like on your channel. And so I was like, okay, sure, fine. And so we did that. And that actually kind of like got me interested in like the question of whether or not Catholicism is actually true. And as I started to look into it, I was like, hey, there's actually more to Catholicism than I initially thought. Like it could actually be true. But nevertheless, I had these objections that just stuck out to me as these are reasons to not become Catholic. And so I stuck with those for a while. And so my interest in Catholicism actually wasn't that strong for maybe about a year or two. And then it was something that happened recently when I heard Joshua Sijuwati lay out this account of divine simplicity that actually made sense to me. Like the first time that I heard this doctrine spelled out in a way that made sense. And I was like, that has been traditionally like one of the biggest objections that I had to Catholicism was this notion of divine simplicity.
Is he Catholic?
He is. And he was a Protestant. So he was Catholic. He converted to
Side note, one of the great things about Capturing Christianity, your channel, is you do actually expose people to the intellectual side of Christianity. And the way you do that, and the way I think you intend to, is by bringing these guys on. But as you, I'm sure, notice, you'll bring some academic on that nobody's ever heard of before.
Yeah.
And then every other apologetics channel will have that guy.
Yeah.
I saw that happen to Sijuwati, or however you say his name.
Yeah.
And I think that would be such a blessing if I were you. I would think, wow, I'm obviously sharing something good or exposing people to a voice that's good. And then it has this echo effect, you know?
Yeah, that is such a blessing that Capturing Christianity can do that. There was actually someone who reached out to me and was like, hey, you really need to have this guy on. And then I watched a debate that he did with Aaron Raw. I think it was Aaron Raw.
Really?
Yeah. You should go watch it.
I will, absolutely.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Is it a speaker's corner type thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So he went over there, and you can see like Joshua. He's like the most buff person you've ever seen, and so he's just like sitting there like explaining like induction to Aaron Raw, like super
Looking all
muscly
cut
built
and
and everything.
beautiful.
Yeah, just looking amazing.
That's
And
what
he's
last
just like
night
breaking down this stuff to like, you know, a level that, well, Aaron Raw was understanding as much as he could. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, let's put it that
But
way.
it was great. You should definitely go watch it.
Yeah, there are guys like him that are the GQ of Christianity, academic Christianity. But
He's so
there
beautiful.
last night, coming out of the little group where you spoke last night, I heard someone talking about he looks a whole lot more built than I thought he would look. And my friend Andy was like, he looks awesome. So anyway, last thing here. So
Okay.
I mean, you can say whatever you want, but last thing from me is I saw Mitt Fried try to get you to become a Catholic by doing the rosary right there on the spot. I don't have a Protestant version of a rosary.
You should.
But I can get a church lady probably within 10 minutes, and she can play. We'll have an organ. We can play Just As I Am, and you can go to an altar and pray the sinner's prayer or whatever you need to do to get this thing nailed down. And I'll say it the way the old evangelist used to say it. Regardless of what happened before, we can put a flag in the ground and say right there, Cameron nailed down where he stands on this issue and with Jesus.
Oh my goodness.
No dice?
No.
Okay.
No.
Well,
dice.
one day, you know, I'm just putting a pebble in your shoe, bro.
That's it. I mean, that's important to do that.
Yeah.
Set a modest goal.
Well, this has been fun, and regardless of what happens with that, I don't want to sound too ooey gooey, but you've been great in my life. You've been a really important person in my life, and I love you, man. I love you like a brother, and I hope we can do more stuff like this in the future.
Yeah, don't cry on me.
You never know, man.
You never know.
You have kids, especially a daughter. You have a daughter.
Yeah.
I have two daughters. When you get to our age and you have kids, I don't know about you, but I cry so much more easily than I used to. It's not you?
No.
No. Well,
I don't really cry that easily.
I didn't used to, but daughters, man, it changes things. Anyway, this has been fun, and we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.